Ashley here, and
Mrs. Emmy.
we're going to go through the feedback for you from your trials exam. So the way it's going to work is the teacher that has marked that section, they will go through that section with you while you can read this, going through the questions in the best way that you could have responded to it, and then leave you with that section some key takeaways moving forward, and then we'll swap over vice versa. So I marked section 1. And the first question, which was out of 4 marks, was outline the conditions that led to the rise of dictators in the interwar period. And this is from an earlier part of the syllabus underneath survey. And I would refer to this as a bread and butter kind of question where you should be getting 4 out of 4. Outlined is a really, really simple directional term where you're just sketching in general terms. You're indicating the main features of. And the conditions that led to the rise of dictatorship in the interwar period, that is just simply the syllabus focus. This table here I'm not going to go through, but that you read that in your own time of the areas that you could have covered in that 4-mark response. In regards to that, the biggest areas of strength that most students did have some knowledge and understanding of the conditions, and some students, a select few, were able to demonstrate their clear understanding of those conditions. But the big areas of improvement were that too many students didn't respond to the question appropriately. They were too vague with their response, and all you needed to do was give specific examples to get that 4 out of 4. And one thing I really want to bring your attention to is by clicking on the sample response, you'll get an example of a 4 out of 4 response that a student in your year group wrote. And moving on to question 2, 4 marks, how would the perspective of source A help a historian understand the methods used by the Nazi regime to exercise control over the German people? So this is the source here from a British student. And this is actually quite a tricky question. And my first bit of advice when you get a question like this, and the HSC if you do, you've got to spend at least a minute or two actually unpacking it. Because if you don't unpack it, you're going to answer it incorrectly. And the big thing here is looking at the perspective. So you need to analyze the perspective of source A, and that's the driver of the question. Looking at how the origin of the source, or the background of the author, or the intended audience, how do those things affect how helpful the source would be for an historian studying the syllabus focus. Okay. In regards to the source A helping a historian, the focus is looking at what information source A would help a historian understand the syllabus focus, not simply describing the source in relation to the syllabus focus. And this here, the table here, guys, is a breakdown of the perspective of the source and how it helps with some limitations. But the big area of improvement here is that too many students read this question and went straight to describing what they saw in the source. Which resulted in a maximum of 2 out of 4. And that was me being quite generous. And too many students didn't engage with the perspective at all. And we really need to fix that. So if you look at the sample response here, it's a student that got 4 out of 4 for that, which they did a really good job of. The one other area I would just bring you back to in regards to perspective that many students overlooked was not looking at the limitations of the perspective of the source. So they were looking at areas of the source that were helpful, but what other areas of the perspective of the source that were limiting it, especially when you think about looking at the origins of the author being British. Do they have an anti-German perspective, and how would that be unhelpful? Okay, so moving on, question 3, 5 marks. What evidence do source B and C provide about the role of propaganda in the Nazi regime? We've got the sources here. Source B from Joseph Goebbels, a primary source. Source C, a Nazi poster, another primary source. Again, the first thing you need to be doing is 1 or 2 minutes, maybe just a minute there, but you really need to unpack the question, looking at what evidence. So we're looking at what information do these sources, source B and C, give you regarding the syllabus focus, but also, just as importantly, what information is lacking from those sources. And this will show the students that got a higher range in this question have known their syllabus, so that when they're talking about what's lacking and what is providing evidence for, they show what they actually know. Source B and C, both of these sources need to be referred to, but in relation to what information they do or do not provide regarding the syllabus focus. And if you look through this table, it's a breakdown of what source B provides in regards to the syllabus focus and the limitations, as well as source C. Okay, big area, similar to question 2, with the areas of improvement, the vast majority of students were way too reliant on the sources, which says to me is the marker that you don't know your content, you don't know your syllabus. Okay, as a result, students weren't answering the question, but just describing the sources. And if you did this, you could not get more than 3 out of 5, and that again was me being generous. You need to interpret the question correctly. And again, read the sample response to see what a top range response looks like. And the last question for section 1 for 12 marks was with close reference to sources D, E, and F. Evaluate the impact of the Nazi regime on life from 1933 to 1939. You've got the sources there to look at. And again, with this one's a higher end question, we've got to evaluate, you've got to be making a judgment here based on criteria. Okay, impact of the Nazi regime is a syllabus focus. And when it says close references to source D, E, and F, they need to be referenced, all of them in your response, but they are to support your own historical knowledge. If you're just focusing on these, okay, it's just description, you're not making a judgment. Again, this is the areas of the syllabus focus that could have been touched on. And then you can see where source D, E, and F is linking up with some of the content. Okay. Areas of strength you can read through. Some students did a really good job. Most students refer to the sources. But the areas of improvement were again overly reliant on the sources, which shows that you don't know your content enough. It's important to know that going into detail regarding the source is not historical knowledge. You've got to bring your own stuff in. And again, big one, too many students misinterpret the question. Okay? They focus on just close reference to the sources, but didn't actually evaluate the impact on the Nazi regime. And again, sample response to get an idea of what a top range response looks like. So just finishing off for section 1, 2 key takeaways to think about when you're looking at the core topic is 1, you need to know your content. You need to know your syllabus and all the information. And 2, you need to interpret the question appropriately. And therefore, when you do that, you'll be able to respond appropriately in your response. Okay, that's enough talking from me, and I'm going to pass you over to Miss Emmy.
All right, guys, so for the National Study Russia topic, I have put the criteria there for you. Some of the key words we need to start recognising that are going to be in there for the HSC are things like comprehensive and reasons judgment, and extensive and accurate historical knowledge, and a response that has evidence. So we need to start thinking about ticking all of those boxes when doing these, because it's not enough to just tick one, unfortunately, as they're all in that top band response. For this section, guys, there were 2 options. The first question, which was assess the impact of competing visions for the Bolshevik Party on the USSR from 1917 to 1928. Only 1 student attempted this question. It therefore perhaps shows that everybody was more confident with the other one, or that perhaps you didn't study this section of the paper. However, for this question, if you did want to answer it, you needed to look at the competing visions of people like Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, and perhaps start with Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution and go through and talk about all the different people that had a different vision for what the USSR and Russia was going to actually become, and then look at the fact that Stalin actually won that power struggle and how that was. But like I said, 1 student did that, and there's quite a lot of feedback on their paper. For the second one, which most of you chose, it was a quote, so the political and economic transformation of the USSR under Stalin significantly improved the lives of its people in the 1930s. To what extent can this view be justified? So you needed to do a couple of things for this question. Number 1, we know a to what extent question needs a particular structure. So not only did you need to make a judgment, but you needed to bring in other information, depending on what your judgment was. And the one thing I felt with this question was there were quite a few people that were not willing to disagree with the statement, which was quite hard. It's very hard to argue that the political and economic transformation improved the lives of people. We can say it may have improved Stalin's life, we can say it may have improved Russia's standing in the world, but the people living in Russia really didn't benefit from the political and economic transformation. And about half of the e-group chose to argue that, like I said, most likely because they didn't want to go against the statement, but unfortunately that meant their argument was very wishy-washy and not very sustained. A couple of dot points there that I've got. Improving the lives, we need to be looking at, like I said,
the Holy Spirit, the angel of the Lord.
Are we back?
I think we're back.
Oh, cool. The Angelus just interrupted us,
Yeah.
guys.
We had to stop and pray the Angelus, but we're back now.
Beautiful. All right, so the other thing I will point out with this question, everybody, it said the 1930s. The NEP was 1924 under Lenin. Therefore, that cannot actually be used as an example for this particular question. I've given you what you could use: collectivization, 5-year plans, lots of you spoke about those. Show trials, gulags, propaganda, lots of you spoke about those for political. Some arguments also brought in things like religious and social transformation and actually used those as examples of improvement for the lives of Russian people, and that's actually quite a sophisticated argument to have. But you didn't have to get the top marks. So some areas, some key takeaway, guys. Most of you answered the question and had some really good information. However, a sustained argument is what was really missing. And that means your introduction, your conclusion, and every single other body paragraph says the same thing. You're not swapping and changing between it was good, it was bad, it was maybe, it was not. Introductions are a little bit of work. I do things with my class like a wow introduction. I should be wowed when I read your introduction. And a couple of introductions, like I said, just weren't very clear. And historians. If you look at that marking criteria, everybody, I'm technically not allowed to give you more than a 10 out of 25 if you do not have one historian. Now, I've put there I was very generous. And if it was an amazing essay, I still kind of bumped you up into the top range, or the next range, I should say. However, they're not going to do that in the HSC, so you need to make sure you've got historians throughout. I've also put there for you, like, sir, a band 6 response that you can look at, and that is one of the few essays I've ever given a 25 out of 25 to, so I would highly recommend you read that and see how the students incorporated historians.
All right.
On to you, sir.
Thank you, Miss. So, back to me. Section 3, Peace and Conflict, was the second section I marked, and very similar to what Miss Emmy was just pointing out to in Section 2, the first question, the first option you had was assess the social, political and economic effects of the war on civilians in occupied territories in Southeast Asia. Not many students did that. More than one, but there was only a handful, 4 or 5. And that might be just that more students were confident with assess the reasons for the defeat of Japan in 1945, or, as Miss aptly pointed out, maybe we just weren't studying this part of the syllabus. And you've got to be careful, guys, that coming into HSC, Miss and I know this well enough, that if you don't study, if you try and be strategic and study just a few parts of the syllabus, it can shoot you in the foot and you don't get asked any questions or options on those ones you feel confident about. So don't go in there leaving any gaps. So the main thing is we're assessing here, you need to make a judgment, and you'll notice in the areas of improvement, the big issue was that a clear judgment wasn't made, a comprehensive judgment wasn't made, but it also wasn't sustained. The top area band students did, but the ones that were looking at a band 4 or 5, low 5, weren't doing it consistently enough. And the social, political and economic effects was the syllabus focus. And so roughly you were just, again, guys, breaking up the social, political and economic, there was a range of things you could have talked about. The big area of improvement I would recommend in a question like this is specific examples. Students are going on about how the social effects impacted people, but what countries were affected and how were they actually affected. Politically, what happened? We know that it actually increased nationalism in the countries, lower levels of politics, it established the foundations of decolonisation, removed European colonisers from the area. Economic, you've got to be referring to banana money, you've got to be talking about the destruction of local economies, the lack of resources, slave labour, inflation, hyperinflation, unemployment. There's a whole range of stuff you can talk about, but they need to be mentioned and supported by historians. So in that essay, most students did have a satisfactory idea of the social, political and economic effects. Most students were able to differentiate between the factors and their effect, and some students had a comprehensive and reasoned judgment that was consistent throughout. The big area of improvement, guys, you need to make a judgment, and I cannot stress that enough. Too many students just outlined the social, political and economic effects of the war, but they didn't actually make a judgment of which factors had more of an effect than others and how. And like with every section, guys, we've got a band 6 response there to show you how you can answer that question well. And from memory, I'm just going to echo what Miss Emmy just said. I don't give a lot of 25s out. I haven't in my history of teaching, and this is a 25 mark response that definitely deserved that mark, and I highly recommend you have a look at that to see what they've done. And then in regards to the other option, assess the reasons for the defeat of Japan in 1945, students flocked to this, okay? And it had a source. Use source G to support your response. Before I even go into looking at this question, too many students jump to this question and use source C as a bit of a trap. You need to be using the source, okay? You need to be integrating into your question. But too many students were relying on source G as their main reference point for how they responded to it, rather than using their own historical knowledge. So again, you're making a clear judgment, which needs to be comprehensive and reasoned regarding the question. The other big one, guys, your judgment needs to be sustained and consistent throughout your response. Okay, your historical knowledge and evidence should be continually supporting that judgment of yours. Here are the areas of reasons for the defeat. We've got poor planning with some more detail, technological disadvantage, leadership issues, Allied counteroffensive, the dropping of the A-bomb, just to name a few. But the thing we notice though is that in regards to source G, you need to use that to support, and that's why I've underlined it, support your response. This source should be used as a reference to supporting your response, not as a starting point. Using a quote from this source needed to be relevant and relate specifically to a point you are making. For example, the Allied counterattack and strategy of island hopping led to, quote, with the taking of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, the doom of Japan was sealed. Or another example, relentless bombing of the Japanese homeland, quote, the B-29 bombings of Japan's industrial cities. They relate to each other, but you're using your own knowledge there. Areas of strength. Students had a really good idea of reasons for Japanese defeat, and they were also able to show how the Japanese contributed to their own defeat. Other students were also able to show how the Allies contributed to Japanese defeat, and most students used source G well. The big areas of improvement, just like the last option, make a judgment. It was not clear enough. Too many students to simply describe the reasons for Japanese defeat and didn't actually make a judgment of their own. Were some reasons for Japanese defeat more influential than others? And you should be making that clear in your response, using the correct language to show the modality of judgment as well. Another area of concern I found was that the amount of writing wasn't enough. Too many students were writing 2-3 pages at most. And that is either a reflection of lack of knowledge, which is study, or poor time management. And if it's one or the other, we need to address that. And again, sample response, guys, and before I leave you with Miss Emmy for section 4, some key takeaways. I think you should already know this, guys. Make a judgment. If the question's asking you to make a judgment, make a judgment. And you need to engage with the question appropriately. Don't just describe or outline. You need to really respond to it appropriately. And lastly, know your content so you can write more. Okay? Because you're really not doing yourself a favour if you're leaving a marker with 2.5 pages for a 25-mark essay. Okay, over to you, Miss.
All right, guys, your last one was Changing the Modern World, the Nuclear Age, our latest topic. I actually thought we would do better on this than what we did, considering the fact that we've just finished it. However, it could be the lack of practice. So the first question says, describe the state programs which the USA developed to counter civilian fears in the period from 1945. It was a 4-mark question. That meant you could not just give me one thing. A bit concerning that a few students skipped this question. And by I mean a few, I mean 5 or 6. So if you are one of the ones sitting there that did not answer the 4-marker, please do not do that in the HSC. Even if you don't know what it says, write something, you get a mark.
Yeah, I beg you, please write something. Yeah.
The answers, guys, you could have talked about obviously any of those civilian fears and any of these state programs. So the educational ones, most of you said duck and cover or how to survive a nuclear attack. However, in most cases, to be honest, that was all you actually said, and that's not enough because that's only one real state program. You should have also spoken about the fact that they tried to develop fallout shelters and that they had a warning system. And I've put there, it was quite an easy question, but unfortunately, students, the average was 2 out of 4. Because unfortunately, you only mentioned duck and cover and explained everything about that video, which is fantastic, but not actually getting the 4 out of 4 marks that we need. Very similar to the power and authority question, which is so marked. Okay, the second question, guys. Explain the nuclear capacity of the United States and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 2011. This question out of 9 marks, everybody, needed quite a significant amount of writing. 1 pill paragraph was not going to cut it for a 9 marker, so that's the first thing I will say. The answers could have included talking about a military-industrial complex that both the US and the USSR had in this period. You could have spoken about nuclear deterrence and MAD and how these were developed. And more importantly, you could have spoken about the new technology and all of the things that came about because of the fact that all of a sudden they were allowed to have nuclear technology and therefore you needed to link it back to why did they have this capacity in the first place. I've started my feedback by saying the question was done quite poorly, and I've kind of already alluded to that. You needed specifics in this question, and a lot of people focused on nuclear testing, which I understand happened during this time period, however, is not actually answering the question of nuclear capacity. It's two different parts. So talking about Tsar Bomba and talking about the Trinity test for the entire response is not actually going to get you the marks that's required. The other thing is all of these things happened in the past. The amount of people that were writing about the fact that Tsar Bomba was or is a little bit concerning. So just little things like that. Your opening sentence for a couple of people needs a bit of work. And the other thing I will say is that if you're going to do this question with such a large time period, 1945 to 2011, what you're writing needs to be chronological. It doesn't make any sense to start at 1945 and go to the 60s and come back to the 40s because it's not showing the marker that you know how it progressed over a period of time. So I would recommend that you plan first for something like this so that you know exactly what you're going to write and which order you're going to write it in. Okay, the last one, evaluate the impact and the legacy of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a 12 marker. Again, I thought we would go better considering the fact that this is in 2 of our syllabuses. So we've got it in Pacific and nuclear age. I was expecting a really consolidated response, and me and Sir thought this would be a really good question to test how much you're actually studying. And unfortunately, you'll look at my feedback and it's actually not fantastic. So some of the answers included looking at the impacts of what happened directly after the bomb, and I've put a whole heap of things there for you, and obviously looking at the legacy. Now, because the question said impact and legacy, it was not enough to just choose one or the other. Unfortunately, if you did that, you'd be sitting around a 6 or a 7, which I think was the average. So I've said here for some feedback, guys, we did not use paragraphs for this essay. Anything above a 10 marker should be structured as a mini essay. So we need to be putting in an introduction, some paragraphs and a conclusion. Both of the parts of the question, like I've already said, needed to be dealt with equally. Again, we had some issues with past tense and using that. And I have put here the average was 6 due to the lack of information that was written. It's not enough just to say the atomic bombs were dropped and people died. Unfortunately, for a 12 marker, that's not going to cut it. So we need to have some specifics in there about what actually happened. There was one student in the year group who achieved 25 marks in this entire section, and each of these questions were phenomenal. And so I have actually put that in there for you so that you can see how you would answer each of these questions using historians, using historical knowledge and making a judgment. And I think they're the key takeaways for this section. Just because they're short answer, it doesn't mean we forget everything else we've learned in all of our other topics. Maybe before we go, guys, so we might just show them the averages at the top.
You read my mind, because I was thinking in my mind just then, we could be a bit despondent after all this feedback as I'm just scrolling through page and page. But Miss Emmy talked to me this morning about this, about how we might not be overly happy with, some of us might not be, but if we get a bit of perspective here, Miss is going to talk you through this now. There is a bit of light out there.
Yeah, so guys, it's not all doom and gloom, and we know you tried your hardest, and I say to my class all the time, the mark that you got is a plus. You started on 0, so you've got a plus next to your name, whether that's 15, 50 or 90. But here are some averages. So our averages are obviously in the middle there for each of the sections, and just in comparison to the state average from last year. So for example, the state average for Russia in the HSC last year was 13. Our average was 16. So you can see we're only really two marks off our average from last year, which is quite achievable in the 9 weeks until we get to the HSC. And same with Pacific, guys. We're actually ahead of the state average already by 3 marks, and we're only 1.5 under ours from last year at the HSC. So we've definitely got the potential to smash our averages from last year with a bit more study. The writing ability for me, sir, it's there. It's little tweaks, but it's there. But it's the content, guys, that we need to start working on. So highest mark was 95, average mark was 60. So that just gives you a bit of an indication of where you're sitting. Me and Sir will probably do an activity with you about goal setting and what we can do to further help you in our study lessons coming up. But like I said, it's not all doom and gloom, but we do need to start thinking seriously about the fact that we want to increase those averages.
Yeah, guys, this is the time to really step up. It's 9 weeks, as Miss said. That's a really short amount of time when you look into the scope of things. A little pain for a lot of glory, really, that's the way I look at it. But my final message, keep calm and study history. Miss, anything else you'd like to say?
I'd like to thank Sir for letting us film this. It was great.
Excellent. Thanks for being my partner in crime. And guys, see you soon.
Have fun.
Bye.